Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of Brainwashed by Tom Burrell. We're in chapter 9, which is titled Bred to be Led. Why do we so willingly give up control of our lives? And it starts with a quote from a Christian prophetess named Juanita Bynum. Now, we're not really giving knowledge and we're not giving educational information. What we're doing is teaching people how to fly in the spirit. Oh, the spirit did it. Oh, I'm waiting on God. Oh, the Lord will do it. The church is trying to hide behind spirituality when God is saying, I've given you power. Now you've got to get wisdom. Speaking in Atlanta, Georgia, before a group of clergy at the 2007 Baptist Gospel Conference, Juanita Bynum, an internationally known Pentecostal televangelist, author, and gospel singer, confessed she planned to deliver a hard message. Instead of providing knowledge, educational information, and directing church members to realize that they have God inherent, God given power, churches are still encouraging parishioners to simply wait on the Lord to solve their problems. Bynum preached, now there's been a switch. The people that are in the pews have got themselves together, and the people in the pulpit are playing games. We can't keep coming to the body of Christ, preaching baby messages and babysitting the people of God. The church has got to get up. It's time to go. Greetings, forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Great show last night, by the way. We're on page 186 of Brainwashed. I'm not sure how deeply Bynum had explored the subject. Her sermon was aimed at church leaders, not at the people in the pews who enable the ministers she chastised. Either way, she provides a serendipitous segue to our next topic, transferred responsibility. Somewhere in our American Odyssey, we have turned over control of our lives and our destinies, not only to the church, the original leaders of the African American community, but also to the leaders of civil rights organizations and secular organizations. These selected emissaries articulate our frustrations and concerns and tackle racial and social injustices in our name. African Americans have been conditioned to turn their personal power over to men and women who encourage them to wait on God or depend on external forces. The only God you need to wait on is the God in you because you have within you the power to change your situation. Continuing the text. The danger of dependency starts with a quote from Nathaniel Branden. He says, if implicitly we teach people victimhood as their core self identification, we are not teaching self responsibility. We are teaching dependency and impotence. The danger is that they will feel somebody has to do something, and that if the rescuer does not come, they are doomed. My notes. You are your own hero. You are your own salvation. You are your own rescuer and savior. Continuing the text. We look into the origin of the Black church and how it provided a template for leadership for today's Black secular organizations. But we first need to underscore the psychological rewards and costs when one keeps or gives up control of one's life. In our chapter on the African American achievement gap, We briefly touched on Dr. Julian Rodder's 1966 External Internal Locus of Control studies. Rodder basically developed a means to determine high or low levels of control by rating individual beliefs. If one thinks their life circumstances are under the control of outside forces, they have a low level of control. If, on the other hand, a person believes things happen primarily based on their own behavior and resources or inside forces, they have a high level of control. Those who recognize the power of the inside force are believed to be more psychologically adjusted. They have higher self esteem and influence over others and accomplish more because they basically believe they have more control over their lives than those who believe their lives are under the control of outside forces. The pull of the pulpit has starts with a quote from a coach named David, who's 36 years old. In the church and through the minister, you can find all the answers. In fact, they are written down for you. You don't even have to think your way through the Bible. That's the minister's job. What I find compelling about the Black church is that embodied within its structure are all the key elements of classical marketing and advertising campaigns. It has an objective, strategy, and tactics. The stated objective is to spread the gospel and offer solace and salvation. Tactics are multifaceted, ranging from street corner ministries to stadium sized megachurch services. The pervasive messaging includes books, websites, speaking tours, televised revivals, and more. There's plenty of merchandise to reinforce the brand, including books, videos, and everything else from holy water to holy hankies. If there's any doubt about the institution's marketing power, watch a mega church worshiping gala on Sunday morning cable. You'll see loyal parishioners packed into spacious stadium auditoriums, mass choirs, professional bands, visuals, praise dancers, praise teams, and a bowl of high-tech emotional revival that would compete with any Super Bowl halftime show. This form of church worship has become a master media marketer, delivering influential messages enhanced with holy glitz and pious passion. What may go undetected, however, is another form of the Black inferiority marketing campaign as it pertains to the church. It's God mandated inferiority. Come, all ye sinners, starts with a quote by Dolores, who's a 45-year-old teacher, saying, the implications are there. We are sinners. We can't help it. It's in our nature. So the only medicine, the only way to get right is to go to church every week and get your weekly dose. Mainstream Christianity programmed us to accept and embrace suffering and oppression. Although it's a general religious precept that we are all sinners, Blacks were taught that their skin color and servile position in life were heavenly markers of earthly damnation. The Black Sinners, Black inferiority programming was so convincing that we ourselves adopted and perpetuated the conviction. Our religious leaders teach that Christian ideal of redemptive suffering as personified in the form of Jesus. We suffer here, we gain salvation in heaven. I'll add to this, anybody that teaches you that you have to die in order to get to heaven as an individual is teaching you a doctrine of devils. We suffered enslavement and apartheid dehumanization for our own good. We continue to suffer for our own good. Tom Krattenmacher, an expert on religion and member of USA Today's Board of Contributors, noted that the concept of God standing with the dispossessed against the scourge of dehumanizing racism is deeply embedded in Black religious history. These experts of theological propaganda have an inside track with Blacks whose identity is tightly wound around perceptions of inferiority, poverty, and helplessness. The subtle but inescapable conclusion is, should we no longer qualify as oppressed and downtrodden, we would no longer be part of the Black Christian community. This concept can be traced all the way back to our Christian indoctrination beneath the yoke of enslavement. I'll add to this that we hid our spirituality inside their Christianity, whether it was a ring shout, whether it was a Negro spiritual that led us to freedom, whether it was the sacraments that they taught us that ritualized cannibalism was okay. All of these things are things that they taught us during our enslavement that we used to empower ourselves. If the doctrine that you are learning does not empower you to be better and to get up and do something for yourself, it again is a doctrine of devils. The bred to be led dynamics. The following bred to be led dynamics reflect our dependence on the hereafter on Black ministers and Black leaders. They reveal how and why, in this day and age, Blacks are still loyally conditioned followers. Religious resignation. Que sera, sera. I accept God's will without question. I will wait on God. I will not reach beyond what is given. Then we are addicted to suffering. Wretchedness is my natural state and my birthright. If I suffer gladly now, my reward will be in heaven. Makes me want to holler. The need for preachers or leaders who connect to our emotional vulnerability. They then give us hope and lead us through our challenges and troubles. They relieve us of the burden of responsibility. Then there's the prosperity gospel. Attachment to ministers who teach and preach the need for greed. We willingly allow them to take congregants' money without benefit for the flock. And lastly, there is a leadership dependency, the expectation that organized secular groups will speak and act in our behalf. The sense of helplessness if organizational leaders do not offer direction or marching orders. I'll add here that all of these require you to look outside of yourself for a solution. The only solution to your problems is inside of you and in community with those that think like you. The introduction of plantation style Christianity and the Black preacher, the formation of the Black church, and its extension into the civil rights movements, our acquiescence to church and political leaders are all, unfortunately, branches of a tree rooted in 17th century soil. Before examining the modern day Black church's offshoots and extensions, we must focus on the genesis of the first most powerful Black force, religion. Upon This Rock starts with a song verse written and sang by Yolanda Adams. The name of the song is The Battle Is Not Yours. It says, this battle is not yours. It's the Lord's, not yours. What do Nannie Helen Burroughs, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and Martin Luther King Jr., former Congressman Walter Fauntroy, and former executive director of the NAACP Benjamin Hooks all have in common? All were or are active in the arena of social justice and all have roots in the Black church. The transition from church to civil rights leadership is a natural one. The most organized Black struggle was birthed in the Black church. The same theme of oppression and hierarchical redress runs through the arteries of both entities. Excuse me. Like ministers, secular leaders are at the ready to ferret out and confront acts of transgressions on behalf of the flock. Like churches, our major civil rights organizations are funded to act for us, not to encourage individual responsibility. In the post civil rights era, some organizations have attempted to correct educational and economic advantage. They attack racial and economic disparities and other important worthwhile issues, but that's akin to treating the symptoms and ignoring the disease. In the 21st century, the problem for African Americans has less to do with blatant racism than with its imprint on our psyches. We've been brainwashed to internalize the myth of inferiority and have not yet wrested our image from the original myth makers. The masses' gift of religion wasn't to empower, but to contain, to keep the slave's attention heavenward. The term Black leader is a throwback to a time when the slave master designated one slave as his spokesman and or spy. Where do we go, and do we have to go there? Is it possible that these seminal African American institutions always also play a part in the brainwashing process? To many, the very suggestion is tantamount to attacking the church and civil rights organizations and all of their considerable contributions. It's one of those don't go there subjects. We have been programmed to be so defensive about all things Black. The mere topic threatens to become another zero-sum game. You're either for it or against it, pro-religion or anti-religion. You're pro-Black or a sellout. Even so, I maintain that it would be a disservice to our people if we did not examine the complicit role churches and secular organizations have in the Black inferiority campaign. It would also be an incomplete exploration if we ignored how those roots, over the years, have grown a branch of what Minister Claudette A. Copeland calls toxic churches, in which pastoral care has come to mean care of the pastor with no guarantees of care by the pastor. This chapter is an attempt to dig up the soil, to examine the roots, to replant and fertilize the crop for a bumper yield. The Black church and secular institutions have been and continue to be major forces of great power and influence. But as the old saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. God sanctioned servitude starts with a quote from William Moore, a slave from the Westford, Pennsylvania Slave Narrative Project. He says, "Seems like us niggers just gotta pray. Half they life am in praying. Some nigger take turnabout to watch and see if Massa Tom anyways about. Then they circle themselves on the floor in the cabin and pray. They get to moaning low and gentle. Someday, 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 this yoke gonna be lifted off our shoulders." To keep his property under control, the slave master routinely stamped out any sign of emerging leadership. Thus, he was able to train slave leaders who fit his agenda and destroy those who did not, wrote leading Black psychologist Naeem Akbar in his essay, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. Most slave owners, however, relied on another popular means of control: religion. Here, it's important to state the obvious. Slaves were taught to worship a white savior, even though the literal biblical description is of Jesus as a swarthy Middle Easterner. Most available images present him as Nordic, Germanic, blue eyed, blonde, and unambiguously white. With this slanted depiction is the assumption that Jesus' father God shares his son's pigmentation. Slaves were taught from both the testaments of the Bible that a vengeful God created them to be perpetual servants of his superior white children. This reliance on religion as a controlling force introduced what historian John Hope Franklin described as the third strand braided between our enslavement and our liberation, saying, once the planters were convinced that conversion did not have the effect of setting their slaves free, they sought to use the church as an agency for maintaining the institution of slavery. Ministers were encouraged to instruct slaves along the lines of obedience and subserviency. With subtle manipulation, slave owners and preachers used biblical passages such as Colossians 3:22 to validate the wretchedness of the enslaved, which says, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as man pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. By the beginning of the 19th century, the strange braid of African American Christianity was clearly established. A liberating impulse entwined with an enslaving constriction. Noah's curse, or the curse of Ham, central to slave Christian teaching, was but one convenient contrivance used to drive home the message of eternal Black servitude. Though noting nothing in the passage states or even remotely suggests skin color, from the medieval times forward, the passage has been used to explain that dark skinned people were the result of a curse from God for licentious behavior. I'll add here, I'll add here that in the Bible, whiteness is actually more of a curse than blackness is. It's not taught that way, but when Moses' sister was cursed with leprosy, the color left her skin. So she was a black woman, and the color left her skin, and the whiteness or the paleness was the leprosy. Okay. So, really, if you want to get biblical, whiteness is more of a curse than blackness is. Christianization of slaves boomed after the religious revival movement known as the First and Second Great Awakenings swept through the South in the late 1700s. The enthusiastic form of worship, singing, shouting, dancing, hand clapping, and the teaching that blacks, like whites, could receive personal salvation appealed to slaves. Large numbers of people adopted the predominant religion of the slave master, the Methodist and Black and Baptist faiths. The forecast says blackness is the gift. Absolutely. Blackness is the gift. Still, blacks openly accepted the premise that God allowed their enslavement so that they could gain the benefits of Christian salvation. Of course, black abolitionists and some black preachers railed against this notion. Nevertheless, even when rejecting the racist God and using Christianity to promote liberation, a seed of self loathing remained. The idea of blacks as uncivilized, lesser beings in need of the white savior. Again, if you read the Bible and you study the Bible and you begin to recolorize the Bible, so in essence, you're writing your own Bible, then you begin to see that the story is quite distorted from what you've been told because people started off as black. Because if in the Bible, God made man from the ground and the dirt of the earth and blew the breath of life into him, the ground is not white. The ground is black because fertile ground is black. So if you read the Bible and if you study the Bible, you have to retell the story through the lens of blackness to understand that the reality is all the people were initially black. And then you can understand the curse. But they've taught the story differently because it serves them in this moment in time to teach you that black is inferior and white is superior. But if you just grab hold of the idea that you are the master race and you are the original people of the land all over the world, because everywhere white people went, they found black faces, then you will begin to understand that we came from the earth, and coming from the earth means that the people were black. As forecast says, blackness is the gift. The lovable, dependable black preacher starts with a quote from a woman named Dolores. The concept is simple and reads like this: we're so far gone that we need to have this preacher tell us his interpretation of the Bible and tell us how to get closer to God. These things are, in essence, things that we should and could do for ourselves. I'll add to that, the reality is that most megachurches are there to pacify you and to collect resources and direct them into the leading families and founders of the church. Most churches are organized for that reason. That's why so many people get the call to preach, get the call to do all these different things, because that's the easiest way to get people to give you money without begging for it, working for it, asking for it. Think about how much people donate to these Christian YouTube channels or to these preachers in churches. They donate 10% or more of their income to these people to expound upon a word that they could get for themselves if they just had better understanding. Slave rebellions led by Gabriel Prosser in 1800 in Virginia and Denmark Vesey in South Carolina in 1822 panicked slaveholders into strictly regulating religious practices. Although the plantation preacher was most often white, some slave owners allowed black slaves to preach a limited form of gospel, although they were coerced into publicly parroting a version of Christianity compatible with the slave owner. Author William Banks wrote in Black Intellectuals, Race and Responsibility in American Life. Slave ministers found ways to frame the Christian message differently. In Massa's presence, he emphasized obedience and heavenly rewards. But behind his back, within the invisible church, such as slave galleries in white churches or in the slave quarters, many black preachers reworked their sermons, passed along vital information among separated slave families, and at times even helped plot escapes. Roles as trusted, cunning intermediaries between slavery and spiritual salvation earned the black preacher an enduring, cherished place among the enslaved and their descendants. The Colored Way. Black organizations starts with a quote from Charlie Aarons, who was a former slave. According to what was issued out in the Bible, there was a time for slavery. People had to be punished for their sin, and there was a time for it to not be. And the Lord had opened a good view to Mr. Lincoln, and he promoted a good idea. Now, this slave was obviously under the idea and impression that Abraham Lincoln wanted to end slavery for moral reasons, when in fact it was for economic reasons that he wanted to end slavery. He also felt that enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and Black people should be sent somewhere else because he didn't find in his reckoning that Black people and white people could harmoniously live together. Continuing. After slavery, many Black religious leaders ventured beyond the parameters of church matters. The Free African Society, the precursor to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, for example, was such an organization. Established in 1787 by ex slaves as a non denominational mutual aid society, the agency set out to tackle a full range of issues and needs that, according to its mission statement, were not addressed in the regular church gatherings and social opportunities of Philadelphia. That means that these people didn't have a way to bury themselves, to provide for the widows and the poor. They didn't have an opportunity to amass their resources and build schools and different things like that, because all the church did was take from the community, even at that time, was take from the community and enrich a few founding families. You have to remember that the job of the church was to teach and educate the people, was to expound upon the Christian doctrine, was to spread this good message of the good news. But that can only go so far. And that's one of the reasons why churches are dying to this day. And the reason that the boomer generation doesn't understand what's going on is because their generation was better resourced than our generation is being resourced. They had programs, they had affirmative action, they had different things, like even quotas benefited them because they were basically guaranteed employment out of high school, and they were guaranteed good employment that you could raise a family on out of high school. So they were better resourced than we are. They are starving us of resources. And because they're starving us of resources, the church is not a place where we go for spiritual upliftment and guidance. We go to our therapists, we go to our friends, we go other places, because the church is not serving us, because the church is not providing resources to the community. In 1905, a group of 32 determined, free thinking Black men met on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls to contemplate strategies and solutions to address racist barriers that people of color faced, mostly in the South. The group, known as the Niagara Movement, struggled financially and eventually disbanded in 1910. But before doing so, three whites had become members. Those whites were still members when the Niagara Movement morphed into the NAACP, founded in 1909. You see that? Integration, even in the Niagara Movement, which was an opportunity for Black people to come together and think big Black thoughts to solve big Black problems. At that time, they still felt, and to this day, they feel they need white people in order to solve their problems. Considering the times, perhaps it was a good strategy to tone down the drastic platform of the Niagara Movement and create a more racially inclusive NAACP. Or perhaps it was a way to ensure that the solicitations sent out to 60 prominent Americans were returned with monetary endorsement. What is known is that when the NAACP incorporated in 1911, It was a predominantly white agency with only one black executive board member, W.E.B. Du Bois. Alliances with powerful whites exposed black organizations to influences from the dominant culture. For instance, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, author of Righteous Discontent, the Women's Movement in the Black Baptist Church, 1880 to 1920, detailed the double edged sword ramifications of the alliances between Southern Black women and Northern white women in their Southern missionary efforts. The Black groups often adopted the prevailing Victorian notion that Black immorality was the true cause of discrimination. Black women, working with white women's societies, urged Blacks to prove themselves worthy by mirroring white society. So when you see these pictures of Black people dressed up in Victorian era dresses, knowing that they were probably either small business owners or maids or servants or sharecroppers, this is the reason why. Because these Black women were urged to prove themselves worthy by mirroring white society. And the parts, I'll add to this, and the parts of white society that they could mirror were only the public facing parts of white society. So they could dress like them, they could talk like them, they could do the polite, casual niceties of high society like them, but they had no understanding of the inner workings of their household or their finances because they didn't have access to that part of their lives. Just as the slave master chose leadership that didn't threaten his rule and helped contain unpredictable, possibly radical Blacks, prominent African Americans, once freed, adhered to similar agendas. Black organizations in the early 20th century, including the NAACP, turned to whites, not only to fund their efforts, but also to help set the tone and agenda for acceptable practices. Such alliances tend to temper individual acts that whites may consider too radical. One has to wonder if the leaders of these organizations were in a position to take a stand as firm as the one taken by Warmoth T. Gibbs in 1960. At the time, Black students at North Carolina Agriculture and Technical University in Greensboro, North Carolina, had begun lunch counter sit ins at the local Woolworth and street protests aimed at ending segregation. Local white Greensboro officials and business owners went to Gibbs, the newly appointed president emeritus of the university, and strongly urged him to use his authority to rein in the unruly young demonstrators. Gibbs declined, offering a response one doesn't hear often from today's Black clerics or civil rights leaders. We teach our students how to think, not what to think. I'll add to this that you have to remember that in the Carolinas, they were passing laws as late as the 1950s and 60s requiring Black people to work jobs and dictating that if you weren't working a job and were out on the streets, you were charged with things like prostitution and vagrancy, which was a ticketable offense. So if you didn't work for a white person, you weren't even supposed to be outside. Lost in Translation starts with a quote from Ben Jealous, who was president of the NAACP at the time. He says, "We are a very Black organization, but we ain't just a Black organization, y'all. We're a human rights organization. We're a civil rights organization, and we will fight for the dignity of all people in this country." Now, I will say that as the leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, you have an obligation to one group of people, non white people. But as a person that sits there and believes that you're supposed to be fighting for the rights of all people in this country, you lose the mission of the original organization. And it's funny, you know how we talk about the Constitution and the framers' intention and um, the Federalist Papers, and we talk about all of this intent that was imbued into this document and that guides our country. And that's supposed to be the prevailing narrative when it comes to legislation and judicial decisions. You never hear Black organizations talking about the framers intention or the founders intentions when it comes to how they administer the rules of their organizations to this day. But that's just my opinion and observation. Speaking before a crowd during the NAACP's 100th anniversary convention, the organization's newly elected president, who was a 36-year-old Rhodes Scholar named Ben Jealous, made the announcement that the NAACP was strong and the agency was quote unquote winning. Jealous went on to list a number of NAACP accomplishments, including helping to redirect millions of dollars in stimulus money towards public schools, removing the Confederate swastika flag from the state grounds in South Carolina, and delivering the first superwoman of color, Judge Sonia Sotomayor, a seat on the Supreme Court. Of all the accomplishments Jealous named and claimed for the NAACP, he failed to note that the organization did not close the Black achievement gap, didn't lower Black on Black crime, or help millions of Blacks rise from poverty and unemployment. And the NAACP didn't create wholesome families or self sustaining communities. Helping to direct federal money toward public schools, removing a racist symbol, and supporting a Hispanic Supreme Court judge are all worthwhile. But the word winning, as far as I'm concerned, represents a disconnect between some esteemed secular organizations and the people they seek to serve. Consider the results of a 2006 Washington Post survey in which Black men were asked about the greatest problems facing their communities. In their responses, racial discrimination ranked 20 percentage points behind Black men not taking their educations seriously enough, and too many Black men becoming involved with crime. These findings indicate that the general population understands the important issues more than the leadership. In early 2007, Bruce Gordon, the then NAACP president, announced that he was stepping down after a brief tenure. He stated that he wanted the NAACP to expand its mission to include social service. Julian Bond, NAACP board chairman at the time, stated, "Our mission is to fight discrimination and provide social justice. Social service organizations deal with the effects of racial discrimination. We deal with the beast itself." When interviewed, when I interviewed Gordon in preparation for this book, it seems the retired president of Verizon's retail markets division met some resistance in his attempt to steer the NAACP in a different direction, saying, "The big debate that I finally realized that I was not going to win was my desire to get us to be more accountable for our situation and to stop thinking and acting as though the only way to do civil rights is to do it from a victim's point of view." The NAACP, Gordon added, hadn't accepted the concept of advocating within Black communities. We don't need to spend all of our time getting white folks to do for us. We need to advocate within our own houses, our own families, our own communities. So I was clearly on a path to push for accountability, and they just were not hearing it. Old school social change organizations are just that, old school, he said. And if they don't reinvent themselves, they will continue to decline in importance. What some dismissed as divergent leadership styles within the NAACP was really an example of the ineffective leadership of some top secular organizations. Yes, they have done remarkable work in toppling legal and institutional race barriers. They've mastered the art of battling the beast, the external forces of racism. They have not, however, developed a means to maim the internal beast that's devouring our minds, our lives, and our communities. Civil rights in the corporate era starts with a quote from Rafika. I'm not the one who's confused. You don't even know who you are. When it comes to attacking the inner beast, the self hatred, low self esteem, and helplessness that fuels the nation's disproportionately high Black dropout rate, crime, and poverty rates, traditional Black organizations seem woefully stuck in an antiquated model. Furthermore, the sustainability of many of these Black organizations depends on multiracial, well endowed external sources, which limits their scope and their influence. One long established civil rights organization recently listed 7 corporations that donated $1 million or more, and 9 that donated between 500,000 and $1 million. Having spent my life in corporate advertising, I can say with absolute certainty that corporations do not give money away for nothing. They give away with the expectation of getting something in return. At its most benevolent, that something is goodwill. At its most pernicious, it is the inculcated form of criticism and given support when criticism arises. Most of the leading Black organizations' donors include corporations with some of the most controversial business models in America: non union retailers, large pharmaceutical companies, and insurance giants. These companies have nothing to gain from Black groups that promote independent thinking. Critical thought encourages people to follow the money to find answers to burning social questions. It may compel them to support Black competitors or withdraw support from companies whose practices are considered predatory or otherwise harmful to minority consumers. A corporation also has to consider its public image. Mythmakers have done an admirable job of flipping the race debate on its ear. In the so called post racial environment, self empowering Black agendas are now widely dismissed as separatist or racist. It's hard to imagine corporate money flowing to Black organizations that start programs designed to expose and reverse a campaign that has warped our self image and reinforced our sense of inferiority. To be fair, major Black organizations are forced to depend on corporate sponsorship. Since Blacks have been conditioned to rely on outside forces, they tolerate these alliances. Companies pay a form of race penance in exchange for positive PR that derives from being associated with an organization committed to uplifting Blacks. Double helixed into our cultural DNA, it seems, is this paradoxical habit of depending on outsiders to save our race. Slavery is not totally dead, it's just been sanitized, modified, and modernized. We still look to the master for approval, guidance, and support. We reason that since we have no power, we need to be saved by somebody else, usually white corporate businesses or organizations. The social service organization is therefore tethered on a leash of learned helplessness that guarantees it will never, ever bite the hand that feeds it. A holy history of dependence. Reviewing, reviewing the history of the Black church and its expansion into civil rights arenas reveals how the bred to be led dynamics were and still are a powerful force. Religious resignation, contemporary manifestation. Wait on God and accept His will. I will not reach beyond what is given. The historical roots. Slaves could escape and risk their lives, go mad, or learn to live without the freedom to control their own destiny. In most cases, we chose delusion over madness and or death. We replaced hope in the present with the hope in God and the hereafter. Contemporary manifestations of addicted to suffering. Wretchedness is my natural state and my birthright. If I suffer gladly now, my reward will be greater in heaven. The historical roots. Government sanctioned slavery relied upon the religious principle of redemptive suffering. Slaves' wretchedness and suffering were God's will. Blacks accepted the promise of heavenly rewards and worshiped a white God to gain a passport to eternity. Makes me want to holler. Contemporary manifestation. Preachers who lead or tap into our emotional vulnerability through powerful oratory that relieves our pain, gives us hope, and leads us through our challenges and troubles, bear the burden of responsibility. Historical roots. The master appointed slave preacher and the Black church played a critical role in relieving the burden of oppression. Unquestioning dependence on religion and religious leaders for guidance squelched independent thought. Brainwashing elevated emotional responses over thought and manipulated our faith in outside forces. Prosperity gospel, contemporary manifestation. Ministers teach and preach the need for greed. We willingly allow them to take congregants' money without creating true benefits for the flock. Historical roots. We learn to accept our innate status as inferior. Only men and women of God were supernaturally superior. Our need for salvation is so ingrained that we are willing to pay any cost to the gifted deliverer of emotional salvation. And lastly, leadership dependency, contemporary manifestation. The expectation that organized community groups will speak and act on our behalf, sense of helplessness rooted in the belief that organization leaders will direct us or issue marching orders. The historical roots of that, illiteracy and oppression made many slaves believe that they were incapable of functioning without strong leadership. Leaders are designed as superior to think, speak for, and lead us. Starting to do good and continuing to do well starts with a quote from Reverend Carrie Jackson, who's a minister in New York. There is a self serving aspect that race card has helped a lot of people. It's been the fallback position in lieu of critical thinking. You just whip it out. It's similar to the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. We know how to play that card, the race card. We have not a clue of what hand we'll wind up with if we give it up. Years ago, I joined a newly formed Black organization dedicated to promoting Black business development. A major white Fortune 100 corporation allowed us to hold our meetings at its headquarters. The firm always had a host meet and greet us and sit in on our meetings. So you see this here, what he's saying is that even though this major Fortune 100 corporation allowed them to use their space, he didn't indicate whether or not it was free or not, but they were allowed to use their space. They still had a monitor in there, and they were committed to promoting Black business development. One time, company officials told us there was a scheduling conflict and that the facilities we used would not be available. Minor panic set in. Organizers fretted about what to do. Somewhat sarcastically, I suggested that perhaps we, as business owners, could have the meetings at one of our companies. We could even buy our own coffee and sweet rolls, and for once hold a meeting without corporate oversight. Surprisingly, it was an aha moment. Apparently, it hadn't even occurred to my colleagues that we could actually function without outside help. Part of the learned helplessness conditioning requires that we buy into the idea that organizations cannot survive without outside interests funding their very survival. From my perspective, it's better to meet in a church basement or eat on your own dime than to gather at the Four Seasons and dine on gourmet meals complimentary of white benefactors. Some Black organizations are now so large and vulnerable that self preservation and organizational growth are their principal concerns. Without disease and illness, we wouldn't need doctors and the healthcare system. Without criminals and crime, police officers and the prison industrial complex would serve very little purpose. Likewise, without overt racism, there would be little purpose for Black leaders or organizations with constricted race based agendas. With no other bucket to cast down, it may be in their best interest to maintain and not solve the race problem. Passing the plate for truth. The need for radical change becomes more urgent when we weigh the temporary benefits of supporting outmoded institutions against the long term costs of promoting collective obsolescence. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. We're on page 201 of Brainwashed. We're talking about why we so willingly give up control of our lives. And the reality is that it doesn't even occur to most of us that we're giving up that control because we were bred that way. We've been trained that way for generations to give up control to the minister, to give up control to our boss, to give up control to some white benefactor instead of taking on the personal responsibility and accountability of solving our own problems. Short-term benefits of religious resignation, accepting whatever God has willed and awaiting on heavenly rewards to remove the burden to individually draft our own fortunes and futures and makes us feel better about bad situations that we can't control. The long-term costs. Believing that God has willed misfortune upon you reinforces a sense of innate worthlessness. Waiting on heavenly rewards robs you and your family from exploring and finding rewards right here on earth. Addicted to suffering, short term benefits. It provides a biblical rationale for our perceived wretchedness. If it's our natural state and birthright, then we can tolerate suffering with the hope of a heavenly reward. The long term costs. Perception of divine wretchedness becomes a self fulfilling prophecy. Believing it is your natural birthright to suffer allows you to unconsciously tolerate or even seek suffering. What he's saying here is that you begin to accept the unacceptable because you believe you deserve it. Makes me want to holler. The short term benefits. Hope is a valuable commodity. We gain immediate gratification from ministers who lead us through challenges and relief from the personal burden of actually doing something. But the long term costs, seeking external avenues of hope and transferring the burden of responsibility keeps a person in a childlike position while elevating another human being to a godlike status. Seeking personal gratification through God's minister is like a drug addiction. It can only provide temporary escape. Anthony McPhail says, greater is our reward in heaven, while others create their own heaven in this world. And he's absolutely right. We've been sold the idea that there's a heaven or a hereafter where we'll have streets paved in gold and all of our needs will be met. Well, that's not even what the book says. The book talks about worshiping and praising God all day long. It doesn't talk about reuniting with your loved ones. It doesn't talk about a lot of things that are doctrinally unsound that they tell you you're going to get in the hereafter. What it talks about is worshiping and praising God all day and all night. That's it. So, what heaven are they talking about? The new heaven and the new earth happen here on the earth after you rise up and turn over the shackles that they have placed on you and that you have placed on yourself. The new heaven and the new earth happens with social and political upheaval. But that's a conversation for another day. Prosperity gospel, the short term benefits. Our value and self worth are demonstrated through our ministers' fame and material achievement. Surely, someone who preaches prosperity must look prosperous. Congregants must invest in the blessed messenger within the hope of prospering. Basically, what he's saying is, if I can't have it, me and all the other people that come together at this church can come together and our pastor can have it. So you're taking your resources, your 10%, the 10% of all those people that go to church with you, and you're investing it in your pastor. And the only thing you're getting in return is a Sunday morning show. The long-term costs of the prosperity gospel, seeing our value and self-worth through the fame and opulence of a religious figure ultimately only benefits the religious figure. You have just as much a right to prosperity as the deliverer of the message, and a better chance of achieving it through your own initiatives. And lastly, we have leadership dependency. The short term benefit. Since we feel unqualified and incapable, it's best to wait on guidance from respected leaders. Following individuals already identified as our leaders who have the proper connections and clout simply makes sense. the long-term costs of leadership dependency. Waiting on the guidance or actions of a respected leader or organized group robs us of the rewards of individual action. It also reinforces feelings of personal inadequacy. Sometimes the leader with the impressive connections and perceived clout is beholden to the agenda of the agent who granted such a privilege. What he's saying here is that people that seem to have it all together, that have all the right connections, that have the money, that have the clout, that have everything you think you need in order for you to follow them, often beholden to paymasters and people that have other agendas that are contrary to whatever your agenda is. If you think about the modern day leaders, we don't even select our leaders. Our leaders are selected for us, usually by a group of non-Black people. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. I'm so glad you're tuned in. We're on page 203 of Brainwashed, Bred to be Led. We're almost at the end of this chapter. Bred to be Led, Positive Propaganda Cues. In the spirit of creating self appointed leaders, I offer these positive propaganda cues. Fellowship, not fellowship. Become a member of a fellowship, a group of people who exchange ideas and openness rather than a fellowship that mindlessly trudges after those who may lead you somewhere you don't want to go. Don't take KNOW no for an answer. Question the whole idea of certainty. Be able to recognize the difference between believing and knowing. And then this is the most important piece. Look for the leader in you. We need to reorient ourselves to understand our innate strengths and the ability to find, define, and develop our best selves. Forging a new kind of leadership. Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood of Brooklyn's St. Paul's Community Baptist Church once saw his church described in the New York Times as one of God's Alcatrazes because of the depressing, crime-filled surrounding area. 10 years after he became pastor, St. Paul's parishioners have transformed the neighborhood. The church built a school on its property and turned abandoned homes and houses of ill repute into family-owned homes and businesses. Youngblood and his church also played instrumental roles in the construction of some 2,300 single-family homes in Brooklyn. Part of Youngblood's appeal, wrote Morris Sheehy in the Christian Science Monitor, is his ability to connect the church and spirituality to the daily lives of his congregation. This is a man that took the money that he was receiving and did not just enrich himself, he enriched his neighborhood. He eschews the more traditional wait for deliverance in the promised land brand of rhetoric for an approach committed to change in the present, Sheehy wrote. Youngblood's interest in connecting the dots between slavery and its present day manifestations led to the creation of the annual commemoration of the Ma'afa, which is a psychosocial dramatic depiction of the horror of the transatlantic slave trade that pays tribute to the millions of men, women, and children who were lost in the government sanctioned multi continent sale of humans. In 2000, the AME Church elected Vashti Murphy McKenzie, a former journalist, as its first woman bishop. McKenzie not only broke what she called the stained glass ceiling as pastor of Payne Memorial AME Church in Baltimore, Maryland, she emphasized her management and community building skills to increase the property value from $1.6 to $5.6 million. McKinsey launched 25 innovative ministries and initiatives ranging from welfare to work programs to senior citizen computer classes to high school job fairs and to establishing companies such as a catering service for former welfare recipients. Mackenzie expanded her influence by presiding over the AME Church's 18th Episcopal District with 200 churches and 10,000 members in Botswana, Mozambique, and Lesotho. I've yet to see Mackenzie, who gives new meaning to the phrase prosperity gospel, on a Sunday morning cable trying to convince congregants to buy her a mansion or lease her a Bentley. Initiatives like those of Reverend Youngblood and Bishop McKenzie are representative of ministries who don't oversee celebrity churches. Instead, they use their gift of influence to empower communities. Even if we aren't perfectly aligned with their specific religious beliefs and or political associations, their do for self best practices should be studied, adapted, and adopted. Such religious and secular leaders operate outside the maze controlled by powerful benefactors whose gifts are rarely free. Although we have been conditioned by a lifetime and actually generations of destructive images and messages, this learned helplessness and conscious and unconscious dependency has outlived its usefulness. Reversing this negative inheritance will be difficult, extraordinarily so. As Bruce Gordon said during our interview, we may not have all the power we want, but we do have all the power that we need. It's time to claim it. Once we reverse the mind game, once we understand that we need not depend on leaders or any external force for guidance, once we recognize that we are all potential agents of change, it is then and only then that we become an empowered people, prepared to think critically and engage fully in self advocacy. So, as you can see, there are opportunities for biblical doctrine to empower and uplift people. Nat Turner took that Bible, the pieces of it that he was given, and he went on a massacre and he freed people and he terrorized the white folks. And that is one of the things that I try to do when I talk about the Bible, is to use it as an empowering narrative. As I said earlier, if you understand the book, then you begin to understand that whiteness is really the curse and they are really the ones that should be in the subservient position, because when they talk about the absence of color, when they talk about the whiteness of skin, when they talk about leprosy, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about white people. But that's just my opinion. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's program. I think that we have to get to the point where we are doing for ourselves, where we are empowering ourselves and we are taking the most empowering narrative that we can find and we're using that to uplift and benefit ourselves and our people. We have to stop accepting the idea that else is coming to save us and recognize that we're here to save ourselves. We have to recognize that we are our ancestors. We have to recognize that everything that was within them is within us. We have to recognize that we are empowered to change reality. We have to get to the point where we are taking the text and we are recognizing that some of the things that we have been taught and told don't even make sense. They don't even make logical sense. So since it doesn't make logical sense, what makes more sense? What is the more appropriate outcome? What is the more realistic perspective of what's going on. Is it more realistic to think that although it seems like it's been a long time, that as Dr. John Henrik Clarke would say, this is just a blip in history? Or does it make more sense to recognize that we come from kingdoms and that these people have turned the world upside down with their golden age and their enlightenment era, where they whitened everything in their renaissance, when it's time for us to, and it's actually time for us to have another renaissance and to recognize our power? Why do things have to get so bad for us that we get to the point where we just can't take it no more and we just start exploding all over the place? We have to obtain power and maintain power. And that starts with the power of yourself and empowering yourself in your family, in your community, in your neighborhood, in your area, connecting the dots and doing the things that you need to do. I want to thank Anthony McPhail, the forecast, Sister Ron, the elders that listened with her. I know that KW Don 7 is listening, MG2 is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. Boana Haguziki is listening. Manning for Mayor is listening, and so many others. Remember, this show is a part of a podcasting network called KWAZ Radio. The other shows on the network are The Forecast Radio, the Bitter Medicine Podcast, Shoot the Breeze on Saturday nights, the Forecast Radio broadcasts on Wednesdays at usually 8:30 or 9 p.m. Make sure you follow him. The Pro Black Perspective with Oni Tase, D Webb and the Harsh Reality Podcast, Kofi the Black Critic, Cassidra Cheek on the Cassidra Cheek Show, and Brother Bakari from the Black Business Network, as well as Kofi the Black Critic and his name is Kofi. I thank each and every one of you for being here. I value your input, your thoughts, your opinion. I appreciate your contributions. It helps me buy more books. I'm not on the paid plan for StreamYard because I use my money to invest it in books, and we have some really exciting books coming up. This book should be done in 3 weeks. And when this one is over, I'll put up a poll and we can start talking about what the next book is going to be. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. And I will see you on Tuesday, where we'll be reading The American Slave Coast. We'll continue reading about how Thomas Jefferson was the main proponent of our enslavement, how Thomas Jefferson, for his own selfish gains, was the main proponent of our enslavement. People in France thought that he was a friend to the African because they saw him with Black people in France. But they didn't realize that those people were enslaved and not able to run away because they had family members that were enslaved back in the Americas. And he probably threatened them and said, if you run away, I'll kill your family members, because I could see him saying something like that. All right, guys, I will talk to you soon. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I appreciate you. Peace, guys.